Welcome to the Pantheon Plus Rewind. Happy Sunday, everybody, and welcome to another week of the Rewind, the show dedicated to all the hot topics around the upcoming MMORPG, Pantheon Rise of the Fallen. I'm very excited for today's episode because Theric and I have the pleasure of interviewing a truly impactful designer who's had an undeniable and what will be a lasting imprint on the MMORPG genre. We'll hit all the hottest topics with him and get his takes as a seasoned veteran in the field. Now, I could sit here and tell you about him, but I think he'd probably know a little bit better than me. So without delaying, I would like to introduce to you game designer Kevin Jordan. Kevin, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. How are you?
Doing good. Excited. Theric, you're ready for this today, right?
Oh, I've been excited for this all week. We had so much hype in the last rewind last week during the chat. People, that's what they wanted to talk about. They didn't want to hear what we had to say. They wanted to know, when are we going to be talking to Kevin? So,
yeah. Well, Kevin, before we jump into all things MMORPG here, first of all, thank you again for giving us some time. And I'm excited to learn from your experience as a fan who's going to challenge some stuff maybe here a little bit and get your take. Yeah. But if you don't mind, before we jump real deep in, for those that don't know who you are, can you just talk a little bit about yourself, how you got started in the industry and just some of the stuff you've been a part of?
So I started actually my Blizzard career as in tech support. So I tell people to update their drivers, et cetera, et cetera. And then the team one of the teams at Blizzard that was working on a different game kind of all caught the EQ bug. And so they decided they wanted to make an MMO after playing it for a while. And I had played a ton of MMOs before that point and had fallen in love with the genre back from Ultima Online days. And then played just every MMO I could get my hands on after that. And so I was super excited in tech support, and the team started working on the game, and I just constantly were sending them emails, annoying the hell out of them with my ideas and everything. And so they kind of got to know me that way. And then eventually a position opened up and I interviewed for it and I got the job. So it ended up being my first job as a game designer, my first game that I worked on. And yeah, I worked on it for 10 years, and I was like the third designer on the team. There was one other guy that was sort of there every day working on the core design. I was brought in as the second game designer, but there was also our lead and founder, which was Alan Adham. But he was only there like twice a week. So it was basically the three of us laying down the foundation of what WoW was going to be essentially. And so I had my hand in a bunch of, fundamental elements of what the game ultimately became. And then as the detail stuff got more and more necessary for each of this individual parts of the game, my focus went to the character classes and the talent system and the talents. So that's what I ended up spending most of my time on, was the 9 original classes and all their talents and abilities and spells and all that.
That's awesome.
So you were there from the very beginning. I mean, that was sort of like from the inception of from a game that's become so huge and changed everything in so many ways and become so central to the MMO space. It's pretty cool that must sort of, does it ever sort of just sit back and just sort of like blow your mind that you were there at the very beginning of this whole thing?
It's funny because I started streaming a couple of years ago, a little more than 2 years ago. And when I started streaming, I had been so disconnected from WoW in a career sense, but also playing it, that I didn't even know that there was this, quiet group that was getting louder and louder about wanting Classic to come out, essentially. And so I didn't even know Classic was a thing until after I started streaming it. And then people were kind of coming to my channel asking me about it. And that was when I was pretty blown away. Because, kind of not in my wildest dreams or in my worst nightmares did I think that the thing I'd helped to make wasn't around anymore, essentially. And people wanted it to come back, because I had always hoped that, that the groundwork that we had laid so many years ago would just be a stepping off point for the genre. Just like, the games before us had inspired us so heavily. I had hoped that, our game would, again, just be another step towards bigger and better things. So it was exciting at one point. It was gratifying at one point for that people wanted classic, but it was also kind of a bummer, that but they hadn't taken that torch and kept running the race, kept circling around and making everything better and better,
If retail was more like that, they wouldn't have to go backwards, right? Makes sense.
Retail changed quite a bit, and some people love it because it's changed and think classic is dated and all that stuff. But I'm likely talking to a crowd that's just like, bring back the old ways, right?
Yeah. So, you don't see a lot of games where people want the older version of something.
Yeah,
they make remasters and they do like updates, but they don't go back and say we make it the way it used to be.
Yeah, and it's definitely testament to the staying power, especially when it's like PvE. A lot of it is PvE, like people doing old raids that they've done a million times in some cases. Wanting to go do that again is pretty interesting.
Yeah,
for sure. So,
what'd you think of WoW Classic? I know it's not exactly the game that you built. A lot of people really enjoyed it. How do you think they did, like looking from the outside in on bringing Classic back?
I'd say overall it was a tremendous success. I think, it's 99% what I worked on. And, we love to complain about the 1%.
Yes, we do.
That isn't quite there, but in reality, it's amazing. It's amazing to be there and be able to play it again. And I think a lot of people are having a great time, and a lot of people are reliving the glory days for some, and some that are trying it out for the first time. And there's very little like it that's out there on the market right now. So, it's kind of, I think it's been a huge success, and I'm really happy that they saw to making it happen after all the struggles the community went through to get it out. Awesome. Get it out and playable. So amazing.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's an incredible story. And it's funny you brought up the, just annoying them with emails. Theric, we that's what I did to get us our interviews and our content for Pantheon. See,
it's a viable strategy.
It is very viable. I would, a funny story, Kevin. So when we started, 2 years ago, I never did any of this. Like, I didn't know what I was doing. It was the worst streams you ever see. The quality was horrible. It was hurting people's ears with the audio.
Right.
But every month I emailed Ben Dean, who's like their communications leader and producer, and I would email him our statistics, like, just so you know, we have this many followers every month. Right. And I think it took him about a year to respond to me, but once he did, it was good. So, so that's a good strategy for everybody out there. If you're like, how do I just annoy people?
There's at least a chance, the pity hire will come your way, right? Maybe we can just put him in a closet, and then he won't have to send us emails.
That's right. Exactly.
What would we pay him to stop sending us emails?
That's right.
Exactly. That's our strategy.
All right. So to give everybody a quick heads up of what we're going to talk about today, we're going to go over a few different topics. We're going to talk about class design. We're going to talk about one of my favorite words that we bring up all the time, meta, and we're going to relate that a little bit into itemization. We're talking about player behavior, especially around like the genre evolution. I think that's a pretty important topic that we talk about often. And then we're going to wrap up the main topics with talking a little bit about open world and instancing, just to get some thoughts on that and perspective. And then I want to thank the community. We got some good questions that we're going to ask as part of the little mailbox segment we always do. Just a few questions so you guys can actually ask Kevin for his thoughts on those. So I'm excited for all of that. But Kevin, you said straightforward that, what ended up being your baby and what you really sank into there was the class design. And I'm a fanatic for classes. I think for me, any MMORPG I've ever played, the uniqueness of individual classes to me is really important. what brought me to Pantheon 2 years ago, this early in this development, you know, with not much to grab onto, is one of the key tenets they put out, like a list of tenets that they say the game will stick to, right? Like these are what we're building off of. And it's the fact that they think they've said that the classes are going to have their own unique identities, and they're not going to be watered down into sort of a one size fits all that we've sort of seen in some other games where like everybody can kind of do everything.
Right.
So let's go ahead and I'm going to ask you the first question really tied to that. So what piqued my interest in you and your work that you put into creating WoW's classes, again, is because I'm a huge class design fan. I love them. I can talk all day about classes. So if you had to take all the work you've done and everything you've seen in classes across the genre, what do you think goes in or factors into that whole creating a class with a unique identity? So couple part question. That's the first part. Right. How do you create a unique identity? Do you feel it's gotten off track in MMOs, and sort of what do you think's led to that? So 3-part question, have at it.
Right. Okay. So a big element for me, I'm a huge fan of psychology, right? And one of the core things you understand from psychology is not everyone thinks the same, you know? And obviously, you know, as soon as you develop empathy, that's one of the core elements of empathy, is understanding that everyone doesn't think like you, and you have to get inside someone else's head to really be, you know, empathetic towards what they're thinking, why they're doing the things they're doing. Right. So understanding that people are different and they approach things different and they get joy out of different things is an important element for me in class design, because you're trying to offer different experiences with each of your classes to those different mindsets. And that plays into the thematic, it plays into the feel, it plays into the play pattern. And it's really important because if you're trying to serve one type of player with all of your classes, it's either all hit or all miss. But if you're serving, let's just say in WoW's case, 9 different types of players, then you're going to hit with some of them and miss with others. But overall, everyone's going to find a thing, right?
Yeah.
And so you're going to please a lot more people, you know, with this approach than you are with like making everyone sort of a homogenized version with the same types of rotations and, you know, the same tool sets and the same answers to everything. And so that's a big part of it, is trying to figure out how to serve a lot of different people, you know, different foods essentially, because everyone's taste buds are just a little bit different. The other part of it is just, I think there's, like most of us, when we're role playing, one of the first things a lot of us do is imagine a character from a video game previous, or a movie or a book or whatever it is, some iconic type of character. And then we try to make that. And those come in so many different flavors over the years for so many different people that you want to sort of hit the big, you know, whether it's fantasy tropes or sci-fi tropes or whatever it is, you want to try to cater to those things so that people can try to achieve that goal. So whether it's Conan or it's Gandalf or it's, you know, Gimli the dwarf, you know, like you're hitting a bunch of different potential favorite characters that people have, and those all take very different, you know, paths when it comes to delivering on what that experience is. So that's why it's important to, you know, when we talk about class identity, which is something I'm constantly harping on, you have to kind of go all in, you know, and you have to be trying to satisfy that deep down desire for somebody to live out in this fantasy world as that, you know, creation or that hero that they've imagined in their mind.
Yeah. That's so interesting. It's so true. I mean, it's funny, we joke around because I've always played a ranger. I enjoy playing rangers, and you know, there's no MMO I've ever played where I haven't seen 6 Legoluses running around, you know, as soon as you log in, because like you say, everybody wants to be Legolas. Right. And so it's so interesting that, you know, I think the psychology aspect of it, like you say, is so true. And I think that's a sort of a lost aspect of it. I think that there is like you said, it's they've been trying to do a lot. And sometimes when we try to do too much, we end up doing very little. I think it's sort of, so to speak, when we try to cover all the bases, you end up really not doing anybody enough service. You don't do service to any one particular archetype or one particular class. So I really enjoy it. I think you're spot on with that.
Yeah, and there's another really common trap that designers can fall into also, which is one, designing only things they enjoy is a pretty common one, because there's lots of different kinds of players. So you're not representative individually of everyone that might be playing your game. And that's true from a thematic or play pattern standpoint, but also the complexity level, because as we grow as gamers, and we'll talk more about this with the evolution of the genre, but players sometimes get jaded over 10 years of playing a game that the button presses just aren't tickling their fancy anymore,
Right.
And so the designer's always trying to one up the complexity to keep people more and more and more engaged. But eventually you're leaving behind all the people that have already hit their ceiling with complexity, or new people that are trying to jump into your game. And social games like MMOs rely on sort of a backfill of new players to keep things interesting and keep things going. So when you sort of cut out, that whole group that might be trying to get into your game, but you've designed everything to be this rotation heavy, you have to do these things in the specific order in order to, be max DPS or whatever, rather than just, here's a simple approach, a pretty basic thematic you can wrap your head around, and some tools, for you to figure out. You can leave a lot of people behind.
Right. It's actually let's segue to the question that I had about this topic. And that's, we talk about use the word homogenization. And I think that's a good word to describe it, because in more modern MMOs, the ones I've played at least, there is sort of the idea that, each class basically has some skills in every sort of area. They can heal a little bit, they can DPS, they can tank a little bit. In that kind of class design, my belief has always been, and I don't know where this comes from, but my belief has always been that when you do that, designing content in the world might be easier. And I have no background to know this, but would you agree, or do you think it's more difficult or time intensive to create content when classes are unbalanced? Like when you're trying to create content that utilizes the strengths and weaknesses of different classes that are not balanced, does that require more time and effort from the developer, from the designers?
I think it's actually easier. Like if you want to bring up the holy trinity of tank, healer, DPS, it's actually easier to design content for that. It's easier to define specialists and figure out what the specialists can actually achieve if they're making really good choices than it is trying to figure out where people are going to end up with sort of unlimited choice, because you can't, it's harder to gauge what they're going to do. Are they going to be 80% at everything, or are they going to be 90% at two things and 70% at a third?
Right.
Are they going to be 100% at one thing and 50% at two others? You're not sure where they're going to come down. So, but with specialists, it's pretty clear that the tank is going to want to do tanky things, and he's going to make tanky decisions, and he's going to push tanky buttons. Like he knows his role, and he's just going to do that to the best of his ability. So you can more accurately predict how effective he's going to be by doing that limited set of things, as opposed to, being wide open. So I feel like it's easier to come to a more common balance point with content that makes it challenging when you sort of know what to expect.
That's interesting. Yeah, no, that's really that really shifts my perspective on it, because I didn't sort of look at it that way. But you're right about that. That's really interesting.
Yeah, and then I think also just people enjoy being a thing and being the best at that thing in general. Some people like the jack of all trades, master of none sort of approach, but I think overwhelmingly, especially at the high ends where people are trying to do the hardest content in the game, there's really only room for specialists and people. It's very competitive already just to get on the roster of a raid, much less like be excellent at it. So I think people really tend to specialize, and that's traditionally how games are beaten, especially in PvE environments. You have to be more generalist in PvP because it's more about your weaknesses than it is about your strengths. But
interesting.
In PvE, it's generally about just maximizing your strengths.
I'm happy you brought up PvP because I do want to get to that in a second. But before I do, I'm curious, this is something I've wondered, when you talk about, especially when you were designing the classes, there was much more leeway to have these unique classes, right? Like I remember the experiences of being a Retribution Paladin or that hybrid class, and you felt that being a hybrid. Yeah. And there was a different feel. Now, with that being the case, I know there's probably a lot of internal numbers. You're seeing how many people are playing what. Was there a concern when you were building these unique classes that were going to, like you said, be made for specific people? When you saw a class that was way lower played, but yet it was still being played, was that a panic button? Did you want more people to play it, or were you happy with, where it was fitting?
No, it wasn't really a panic button. I was happy that all the classes were being played, and I tried to look at other factors, right? Like the Druid was low numbers, but that's because only 2 races could be them, 1 on each side. So that felt kind of natural, right? That there were fewer Druids.
Point. Yeah.
So there were other data points to look at other than just the raw numbers. And also I was okay with it just because there's a good side to them being low numbers, and they tend to be more desirable, like if it's hard to find a Druid and Druids are really necessary for whatever reason, let's say Mark of the Wild for simplicity's sake, which is just a buff that people liked. And it also made it kind of neat that when you did run across a Druid, it was kind of a special moment. And then that person who played one of those, played a Druid, felt special, because people were like, oh, cool, a Druid, so there were good sides to lower population of certain classes as well.
That's awesome. That's kind of like Rangers right there. Nobody wants to play Ranger.
But we are the special ones. Everybody loves us.
Well, according to D&D, every Ranger is born because their village got wiped out by their interracial enemy, right? So,
and then they were raised by wolves in a somewhere. Yeah,
so,
I hear you.
There's only so many, villages that have been wiped out, so you can't have too many.
Where are all these Rangers coming from?
Or everywhere you don't want to be.
Oh, geez. So let's get into PvP now. I'm not a designer. I've just played a lot of games, and I'm never going to declare myself to be a designer. And I'm actually one of those people that thinks that sometimes communities have too much say, and I think we'll get into that in a little bit.
Yeah,
right.
But so here's something that has been a really big sticking point for me, specifically with Pantheon, and something I've been saying since my days of playing WoW. When Pantheon was announced, it was very heavily said this is a PvE game. Right. And there was some pressure from the community, and this is way back into the Kickstarter days, when the first Kickstarter happened for the game. And Brad McQuaid, who was at the helm at the time, was sort of saying, well, we're staying with PvE. And over time, he started to get a little more convinced that, there's really this large subset of players in PvP that we'd be silly not to, try to appease, which makes sense. I'm okay with that. But their method thus far, and a lot of this is unconfirmed, but it's pretty likely that the way they're going to do PvP is with a toggle on. You're going to have a toggle on PvP server, and you're going to have the PvE game in the PvE servers. And the game is going to be 90% PvE focused. And they've even said that those PvP servers, they will probably not be really balanced at first. That's not something they're going to focus on. So there's a couple things I'll say here. First, to me, I feel like that might be a mistake because I think PvPers are very passionate. I've seen that quite a bit. And when there's not a balance, I think there's going to be a very vocal, even if it's a smaller crowd, it'll be that vocal minority that's really clamoring to possibly negativity it could bring. Yeah. But furthermore, and this is the one, this is going to make or break me, and I'm relying on your answer here. I have said since day one that no matter what game says, well, our PvE and our PvP are going to be separate, We're going to, the abilities will be designed separately for PvP. It won't influence PvE.
Right.
I don't buy that. I think psychologically, when someone's designing a class or an ability, you're always thinking, well, what are we going to have to do from PvP? So 2-part question. Do you think that putting PvP in to appease it at that level is a good idea or bad idea? And 2, how does PvP affect PvE?
Right. So is it a good idea? My first answer is no, because and the main reason for that isn't balance or anything like that. It's because if the developers take the stance that it's kind of an afterthought, then the players will feel like they're an afterthought, right? So, the last thing you want to be is sort of the redheaded stepchild of the community in a game, right? Where you're trying to force it to work, force it to be good. And the developers just really aren't on the same page as you when it comes to like wanting to support it and make it better and spend a lot of resources on it. So, there's a chance that it just works perfectly, right? Yeah. That it's just, accidentally totally in tune with everything that the PvPers actually want. But the chances of that are so low, I don't even think it's worth mentioning, to be honest. But so that's the key thing is if you're going to invite a community in to play your game, then you should make sure that the experience is as lovingly crafted as you can possibly afford, right? And if you're going to treat it like an afterthought, then it's going to feel like an afterthought. It's going to play like an afterthought, and people are going to get really disenfranchised really quickly. And they're not going to buy your excuse. They're not going to buy your reasoning for why the game isn't better in this area. Because you put it out and you invited them in, they're going to expect a level of quality, especially if they're paying a subscription price, et cetera, to enjoy the experience. So I think what's more likely to happen is they're going to be very let down. And at some point, they're going to hit their threshold for enough is enough, and they're just going to leave. And it's sort of going to be this dead part of your game.
Yeah. It's funny because...
sorry, get there.
No, I was just going to say real quick, if that, I feel like a lot of games, MMOs these days, you have this checklist of things that have to be in your game. And if they're not in your game, you don't really you don't get invited to the party. You're not really an MMO. So, you get housing in in there and you get like, all these other.
That one. Still to this day, there's no housing in WoW, right? So we resisted that one. But I definitely know what you're saying. Yeah. If you're going to do it right. Has always been my feel. So. And it's okay not to have those things. It really is.
Or to not even launch with it, right? Like, again, there's a crowd of people, and it's really from EQ. I think, Theric, it's the Kazakh Thol server, if I'm not mistaken, or Ralazek.
Yeah.
That's what it was.
Yeah, Ralazek was the PvP.
I think there were two,
So what they did, they just turned it on, and it was open world PvP.
Yes.
That's right.
It was Solasek, which was faction.
Yeah,
that's right. That's
okay.
right.
Anyway, sorry. Go ahead.
It is open world PvP. I mean, it's not 1999 anymore. I say that quite a bit. The player base is significantly different. Yeah, right. It was.
I was playing a lot of Ultima Online. It was a good time.
I was skipping school to farm J boots.
But university classes to play EQ. That's what I was doing.
It was bad. But I don't know that. With everything that's out there now, and there's a lot of games. I've played a ton of MMOs because I just love the genre. Like I played Blade and Soul to death, and that was a fun. I don't like PvP. The PvP was so good. It was like playing Street Fighter.
Right.
But with everything that's out there for PvP now, I mean, arenas, battlegrounds, the 3v3 fighting, like guild versus guild fighting. Do you think that like this turn on a server and it's just open world PvP is going to be able to maintain itself this day and age?
Well, it's hard to say. There is a small community of people that want to do mainly the Pve experience, but they sort of want that extra tension of there might just be a guy behind me waiting for me to pull this thing, right? And will that community be large enough to sustain a whole server? Maybe. But some people might just want that sort of PvE plus. It's not really PvP, but it's sort of PvE plus. where the competition is more direct rather than indirect. Like in EQ, it was first to get to the boss, right, and take it down. Whereas this is like you could be second and wipe them out, and then be first, right?
Yeah.
So it's a different feel, and some people just love that. But again, it's like it's going to come down to how good the PvP feels when you're actually engaging in it. Because if the PvE is really high quality, but the PvP that's happening before and potentially after is really bad, then you're in a bad place, right?
Yeah.
So, and some people will just put up with it, but because there are people that will just put up with anything, and all they care about is the win, right?
Yeah.
You either get the win or the loss, and the play doesn't even matter. All that matters is, and this is true for PvE as well. Did we get the boss down? Okay, that's all that matters.
Yeah,
it didn't matter that I hated. I mean, I know a guy, I've been friend with for years who helped on the WoW team, and he did an EQ fight where he crowd controlled snakes for 6 hours straight in the basement. So he didn't even get to see what the boss looked like because he was down in a basement somewhere. You guys might even know the encounter where he was he was an enchanter and he was just CCing snakes for 6 hours straight. Right. Like, to me, that's a mind blowing experience. And I'm like, no way would I ever do that. Right. But that's what you did in EQ. That was just one of those things.
Yeah.
And obviously he was willing to do it, even though the play pattern was abysmal. So some people are just in that boat, right? But
just a different mentality towards how they approach the end result being, the first thing that matters. So
just whatever it takes, right? So, but is that a big enough community? Is that the kind of community that's going to be really good at spreading word of mouth, to get the game to that next level in terms of participation and excitement and that kind of thing? It's hard to say.
Yeah. It is hard to say. I've never been a PvP player myself. I avoid it at all costs because I'm terrible at it, and it's just not the kind of thing I enjoy. But I
kind of always looked like MMOs were like the virtual world D&D, right? Like at a tabletop, to me, like that's what it came from that in MUDs. Like it was always about teamwork, right? I know there are people who PvP in D&D, but the majority of people who played D&D, at least back in the day, was an adventure together, right?
Yeah. So, the PvPers don't get invited back to the next team.
Exactly.
I don't care how much Mountain Dew they bring. They're not.
Where's my gold? Why is it missing?
That's right. And to be honest, like the PvE populace is way higher than the PvP populace, despite how much I think WoW has improved that to some extent. Because when I was hired on, I quickly became the PvP guy around the office, like that nut job who likes to grief people, right? Was like how people thought of me. I was just a PvPer. I liked all kinds of PvPing. Sometimes, I was ganking you, but a lot of times I was chasing down people that were criminals or murderers in UO or whatever it was. So I just liked to PvP, but I was one of the rare people on the team that appreciated its value. And so, and PvP was a dirty word back then because of Ultima Online, right?
Yeah.
Almost every game afterwards was making sure they announced and told everyone up front, this is totally consensual, even if it's in the game at all, right?
Well, what was the UO story about? Like the designer, didn't think people would go out and just be murderers and steal everything, and then the world kind of just became that.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. Ultima Online is essentially like remapping humanity's history, but doing it online in a virtual world.
Yeah, well, it had its crowning moment when Lord British got killed himself,
right? PvP
shot or whatever it was, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Well, before we leave that question, I have to, the one part that's, again, I've based a long time. Yeah. Is it possible to have a working good PvP system that has zero influence on PV? Like design is, I guess, the way to put
it. Is it possible? Sure. I'm a believer in just about anything is possible, but I think the best PvE, PvP crossovers are ones that are designed with both in mind, right? Like they're not separate entities, they're not separate games. And WoW moved away from this over the years, much to my unhappiness, because I did a lot of work in laying the groundwork for what was essentially, what were the similarities between a PvE experience and a PvP experience. Mathematically, I wanted them to be kind of identical, in terms of like how much does a player hit for, how much can he take versus how much a mob of the same level can take, and how much he does, right?
I imagine that's pretty tricky, especially when numbers start getting bigger.
Yeah. So what we saw over time was the PvE became so specialized, and the gear you wanted for PvE was so specialized. It was all about DPS and not about survival. And for the tanks, it was the opposite. So as the two scale up, they get wider and wider apart in terms of survivability. And then you find people one-shotting, each other in PvP settings because they're all DPS and no survivability. And then the tanks are just impossible to kill, but they can't hurt anyone, right? So
they're just annoying.
You get to these weird places, right? And that's why resilience kind of came in, which was this kind of PvP stat that was designed to bridge that gap. But only for PvP. And that's when you sort of officially realize these are two separate games in terms of like the mathematical experience. And that's where it gets really tricky. But to go back to one of your original comments of like, when you're designing an ability, I absolutely was thinking about the impact in PvP with every decision. And to me, it was really important because we wanted both to sort of coexist. And you have to think about the impact, because one of the big differences between players and monsters is monsters don't complain. Wait
until AI takes over.
That's right. And so you can abuse the hell out of monsters. You can crowd control them for 10 minutes straight, but players don't particularly appreciate that for some reason.
Funny.
And so, yeah, you have to figure out how the differences are going to be. And once you have a million differences, then it adds a lot of confusion and complexity to tooltips and players understanding what this does and why does it do different things against this target versus this target. And you don't want the players to have to sort of put on a game designer hat and try to figure out why all these things do the things they do. You just want them to be able to play and have fun and understand what their abilities do. So in an ideal world, those experiences are largely similar, and the crossover is pretty natural.
Right. So last question from in this section on class design, I want to ask you about. You actually mentioned it earlier. You said, a lot of people identify as one role. They say I'm a tank, or I'm always a healer. And on doing this show, Minus and I have heard that repeatedly over and over again from the people that we talk to. And with player identity, class identity, I should say, being sort of a little watered down more than it used to be. How do you think player identity is being compensated these days? Like what are game designers doing to give players identity? If the classes are the same, what are they compensating with?
I don't think that they're actually compensating very well. It's very difficult to. I think one of the few things that are remaining, like if all of us have the same tool set, for example, is how well we apply those tools, right? Yeah. And that's why you see like who's topping the parses, like everyone's gaga and crazy over who's at the top of the parses, who's playing optimally. And that's kind of all that matters. It even matters more than, are you a nice person? Do I like hanging out with you for hours and hours at a time? Like we put up with the fact that you're a total a-hole because you're topping the parses every week, right? That seems backwards to me, So
that's a great.
That is like an amazing point. Like you just blew my mind with that.
Yeah, I actually don't think there's enough like ways for players to distinguish themselves within a class, and more so within a game, outside of like sheer competence. And that's a bad thing because at the end of the day, we're all just a bunch of nerds sitting in a computer game trying to pretend we're heroes, right? We don't have these skills that our characters have. And so what's
you wouldn't
great
know
about
that
RPGs,
though, talking to everybody. Some of these
right,
people think they have these skills.
Oh yeah.
You know how many times I've met the number one PvP, the number one paladin on their server?
Yeah, we talk to every single number one paladin on every server.
Right. And so it's nice when a game gives us the tools to feel heroic and feel like we're amazing, despite not having these skills in real life, right? By meeting us halfway, sort of thing. You know, like I'll put in my side of the work. I'll try to be strategic and smart about my choices and my character class, you know, when to push the button when, but it's nice that I can feel like, you know, this hero that I'm portraying and people around me appreciate it, you know, without having to be like a professional gamer. Right.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. That's not the answer I was thinking about when I came up with the question. I had a different answer in mind, and I really like your answer better than the one I had in mind. The answer I had in mind was something to do with like costumes and cash shop and appearance stuff. Like, you know, I'm thinking about identity from that standpoint, because I do think there is a little bit of that going on too. But
yeah, for sure.
Your answer is much more, I think, a much more, you know, perspective from the inside on it. I definitely
and you definitely see what you're talking about also. So it is a very good point. You see the end game, the true end game, they call it, of, you know, these games nowadays is all about the fashion, right?
Fashion quest.
People stop looking at, you know, it's how do you glamour and Final Fantasy, transmog and WoW, whatever it is, you know, like, and the demand for those systems is through the roof. Because I think that's the new way you distinguish yourself, is how you look, as opposed to, you know, what kind of, like who you are socially, which used to matter a lot. And what you bring to the table in terms of, you know, unique class abilities or different things that change the way we play as a group, or just little things to be excited about. Like there used to be just, you know, like a combo pair between two classes. One class really likes another buff that another class has. So they absolutely are through the roof when they get to group with one of those classes, right? And you can just see the camaraderie the second they join, you know. And they vocalize it, you know. They're like, oh, thank God there's a blank here, you know, because now I can do my thing. And so really important bits that a lot of games nowadays are missing.
I just think it's amazing how you linked it to just sort of everybody being meter hungry, right? Is because there was less to separate people. And it's interesting because I wonder if a game sticks to, you know, there's 3 tanks, for example, right? Like you have tank 1, tank 2, tank 3. In certain scenarios, tank 1 is amazing. It's going to be the best. But guess what? In scenario 2, it's not. And that's too bad. Like that's what's going to happen. I just wonder, like, if they can really, any game can really create true class identity, not be worried about everybody doing everything. If people's eyes shift off the meters, even though we're so used to it, and go back to fulfilling a role.
Yeah. And I talk about moments to shine a lot as being really critical to class identity. And that's what you're talking about. Is like, this one class is really good at this boss fight because, you know, mechanic X versus his ability Y. And he has his moment to shine. Another class can do it, but this class is just a little bit better, you know, because of this thing. And then the next fight, it switches up to a different class, right? So, and you just kind of rotate through the bosses, you know, so that everyone kind of gets their moment to shine. And that covers healing classes and DPS as well. But that goes a long way in establishing identity. And so that everyone feels like the special snowflake, you know, for that fight. And that's kind of what we want, you know, because, like, you know, real life is all about getting our parses up to the highest, right? In various ways. So why do we want a game to behave that way too? We're here to escape, have fun, and, you know, let off some steam.
Awesome. Well, I think that's a good transition into topic 2. And don't worry to everybody out there listening. I just want you guys to know you got them really nervous right there. Both of you started talking about transmog. Everyone knows that, Theric, if you get me going on transmog, it's a whole 2-hour show because I love it. It is my thing. So we're going to avoid it. We're not getting into that. That was not on the agenda. So let's get into topic 2 here. And it's a feisty one for me. Meta. And we're going to tie itemization a bit into that. So, So for those who listen to the podcast, I'm very passionate about the term meta. We kind of were talking about like PvP being a bad word. And I think meta in this community especially is like this evil word. And it's funny because meta exists. I say this all the time and it sounds stupid, but meta exists in everything we do. There is a meta way to eat your cereal in the morning. You're going to use a spoon. Right. You're not going to use a knife. That's the most effective way. So it's just
I just man pour it right down the gullet. What are you talking about? I wear it like a helmet and let it drip down my face.
That's what we brought you on the show for, that kind of insight. That is gold.
That's right.
So this meta thing gets a bad rep. Right. It's I want to play an MMO that doesn't just have meta. Well, number one, I don't think it's possible. But I think that when people say that, they're not worried about meta. It's the Reddit term. I like to use that. Someone latches onto it. I think what people want is more viability. Where like, okay, I may not be the best, but I'm still viable. And I think some games have meta and then it's a huge drop off. Right.
Right.
So you've said, I'm going to use one of your quotes here from one of your videos talking about meta. You said meta is a disingenuous term because when you take the strategy and combine it with skill set, you get the overall best performance. Trying to force a person with a skill set into a different strategy can have different effects. So I kind of say like where you're talking about there is that if the meta is very difficult to pull off and you don't have the skill to pull it off, then it's not your meta. Am I right in saying that? And what do you, how do you combat people who keep saying, I want a game without meta?
Right. So, meta is a very misunderstood term, I think, at the end of the day. I understand why it's misunderstood. But I've got like a whole video on my YouTube that's about an hour long, and it barely scratches the surface of this issue, to be honest. We could easily do a 3-hour show and not be done on just this topic alone. It's kind of insane. But here's some basics, like some high level thoughts on it is that, as human beings, we want to know the truth. We want to know the one answer, right? What's right and everything else is wrong. And so we think in terms of like, is the sun hot? Well, sure. Sun is super hot. Is it the hottest? Yeah, probably, but then it's like, okay, but if I light a candle and I put my finger over the candle, which one's going to burn me faster? It's like, so is the candle hotter than the sun? Right. So it gets really confusing really quick because it's so contextual, right? Everything is so contextual and there's a million variables when it comes to, MMOs and performance and, how like metas are formed. Right. And so frequently, the meta is very transitory, right? Like meta is evolving constantly. Like the number of things that have come out in Classic that are new to Classic that have always been there for 15 years, but nobody knew about and are now doing is still pretty mind blowing. And that's testament to how many variables there are. And people's experimenting still to this day on, what's new and what's the most powerful thing to do. Right. So, and that's going to change again, with every new game and every new release and every new patch that changes any of those numbers. Right. Because the variables are always changing as well. And everything's so connected to everything else that one change here can trickle down and affect many other areas, which can then have a knock-on effect. Right. So the entire environment is really difficult to lock down in terms of what is the best, right? What is the simple one truth, that answers all the questions, whether that question is what's the best class or what's the best spec or what's the best build, what's the best itemizations, right? Like those things are usually an illusion.
I could not agree more. I could not agree more with you saying that because I'm sure you saw the evolution of these class discords for a while. They drove me crazy.
Yeah, for sure.
You had, the guy at the top who's a big streamer who everybody knows, and whatever he says is gospel. It could be completely wrong, but you have an army of people. And I'll share a little inside story here. So for those of you that haven't played WoW, the preferred simulator, I believe most would say, is SimCraft, Simulation Craft. And there's a secondary one called Ask Mr. Robot. And so I'm really close with the Ask Mr. Robot team. They're just great people. It's a small team, great people. And they've given me a ton of insight on like the complicated things they do to find these variances, right? And I also know something, and this might get me in trouble, but they're not listening, so I'm just going to say it. So I know that
there are bugs sometimes.
I know that Simulation Craft, when there are unfavored abilities, specifically those that are hard to program simulation for, they actually just stop really trying.
Okay.
So what happens is there will be a Discord guy who's running numbers and saying this is how it is. They'll stick to those abilities, and the other abilities that look way off when you simulate actually isn't quite true. Right. And, one of the things that makes a player's DPS improve, for example, is movement. And a lot of abilities, a lot of simulation doesn't actually simulate movement.
It's all target dummy simulation, right?
Yeah. So like if you move, let's say you're in a circle and you move 5 steps and then you hit it, but you only needed to move 3. Those extra 2 steps are hugely impactful to your damage, right?
Especially if it comes at the wrong time in your rotation or whatever.
Exactly. So it's interesting to me because
all kinds of stuff.
Meta, like you said, is different for different types of people, but it's also usually, I think the meta a lot of people think is like that causes toxicity is the guy who's the loudest at the top of the mountain, just saying it's the best without any truth. So.
Right. He's carrying the meta flag and actually doesn't know anything about it in reality. But people believe it because he's the loudest and he's able to socially shame or stigmatize or bully other people into buying his nonsense. Yeah. So here's another common misconception about meta, and I covered some of this in my video.
Guys, check that out, and we'll put links, just so you know, Kevin. We'll put links to like your channel and everything in the comments here, so you guys can check these videos out because they're really cool.
Right. Let's say there's only 2 kinds of players. There's way more, but let's say there's only 2 kinds of players. All of us are good at some things and not good at other things. So maybe there's one guy who's really good with doing his rotations. He is the best at playing whack-a-mole with all the lights and buzzes and alerts on his action bar so that he can nail his rotations perfectly. But his head is always buried in the action bar. So every time the monster has something he starts to cast and he needs to, let's say he's a rogue and he has to interrupt, he has to kick it. He sucks at that because he's just buried in his action bar, right? But it's not how much damage he's doing. It's the thing that the spell is getting off and it's actually killing people that is what's slowing people down in the raid, right? So, he's really good at that thing. The other guy is really good at reacting to, new information in the environment. So he can interrupt really well, but he's not as good at his rotation, right? So those are just 2 different types of players. And obviously you want a player who's good at both of those things, but you usually can't find someone who's really good at all things. So you take a certain build or a certain spec and you put it in the hands of the guy who's really good with the rotation and just let him do his thing. And you try to find like another class that's in the party to counterspell, let's say a mage, get him to be played by the reaction guy, so that you can cover both of those bases, and then you have a team that can actually pull off this whole thing. The meta person will come along and say, well, your mage should be playing this rogue spec because it's more meta. Because you want 2 of those guys, right? You don't want, and they'll kick out the mage who's really good at reacting to content, and then you'll end up losing the fight, right? So it's like you have to, the meta is always about what do we have, what resources do we have, what content are we facing, and how do we maximize our potential to win in this particular case, right? Whereas for a lot of people, it's trying to figure out what the best build is and then cramming all the people into that build or builds, right? As if we're all sort of some kind of hive mind and there's going to be one person playing all parts. You know what I mean?
Yeah. It's,
and that's where, you know, kind of poor guild leadership comes in, where it's like the difference between good leadership and bad leadership is being able to work with what you have versus trying to force people to do a bunch of things they're not comfortable doing.
Exactly. It's funny. All my experience with meta actually doesn't come from the MMO space. It actually comes from playing Hearthstone. And I was a big time Hearthstone player for a while. And what I learned about meta from playing that, I think what you said is so important. Trying to force a person with a skill set into a different strategy can have negative effects. One of the things that I always saw was these high level players, some of the best players, the tournament players, they'd play in the official tournaments, that kind of stuff. And they'd stream these decks that were way off meta, but they would win, right? They had the skill set to be able to make those decks win because they had knowledge, the whatever foresight, whatever it was. And then you get people try to play those decks, like just the rank and file, the regular player, and they would have a 20% win rate, 30% maybe. And they would complain and say, you know, like, I don't understand, why is this, you know, this deck, it's not meta, why it should work, right? And you get this angst in the community amongst players who don't really fit into the skill set that deck commands. So they just go back to playing, you know, face hunter or aggro decks and all that kind of stuff. That's generally easier to play. I would argue with that. But
I was going to talk about Magic in this section, but Hearthstone's great equivalent. It's just like there are control decks or aggro decks. They take different types of brains to make work. Because, you know, aggro decks, there's consideration as well. You have to understand what you're up against and when to drop monsters and when not to, because of AoEs and things like that, right? So, but that's just a very different skill set than a control deck or a combo deck, right?
Exactly.
And in one person's hands, like that's why the meta is for games like Magic and Hearthstone. It takes a while to form, and then it's also it's kind of a fluid thing in terms of pairing it up with the people that are going to be playing the decks, right? So
I always thought it was super interesting how the meta evolved in that game. And you know, in my mind, I've said this on the podcast before, but you know, for me, meta is a choice, you know, and I choose sometimes to participate in it and sometimes I don't. You know, like you know, when you talk about meta, the end goal has to be the only consideration. Like if you're talking about something being optimal, you have to have a defined end goal. So that must mean beating the highest level content. And if that's not your end goal as a player, then the meta doesn't really matter for you. You know, like you can sort of disregard it.
So. And I got a lot of feedback on that video I made of people saying, you know, you're missing the point. People want to be the best they can. And those people are missing the point. The point I would make is it's totally fine that you want to be the best and make the best choices in all the environment. But it's more complicated because you're trying to weigh the context. What group are you in? What guild are you in? What are they running? What group are you going to end up with in the raid? Which makes a lot of difference of, you know, what your role is within that group and also within the raid. Do you, you know, duo a lot? Do you run dungeons a lot? What kind of player are you? Where are your skills at in terms of like one skill set versus another? So each person's meta is an individual process that you explore. And I'm all for people trying to gain a mastery of the game and mastery of their own skill set. But I think you're actually doing yourself a disservice if, again, you're a square peg and you're letting someone tell you're to jam into a round hole because someone somewhere on the internet is doing really well with a spec that you hate. Right.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and that's interesting too. I'm going to jump in because you had brought up the whole, I think where meta goes wrong, and I think where a majority of the negative terms that are used now, like you know, all kinds of different things that are negative in the MMO space, is because, you know, people want to. You just said it, like the square peg in the round hole, right? Like people want to be included, right? So what happens is if you're not this meta person and you want to join a group, but that person who made the group wants meta top performing people. Right. The people who don't fit want to fit and get mad. And I've always said MMOs, granted, I'm not an introverted person. I'm very extroverted. And I get that there's a lot, it's easier for me and I'll acknowledge that. But at the same time, like everybody has the capability to, it may not be easy, but to find people that are like you. And number two, make your own group. And granted, I know that's not easy, but I think where people get so mad at meta and where they complain about meta is because someone's kicked them out of the group because they weren't playing what they wanted them to.
Yep. And yeah, it's a term for control now. And control and performance are highly sought after, in today's modern MMO, whereas cooperation and kind of social well-being were much more sought after back in the day, right? I'll give you a classic example, and this is one of those many relationship things like that I've sort of come to realize are so important in MMO design. But in retail, you push a button, you get into a group, they don't like you, they kick you, you're back in another group within 5 minutes, right? And so there's no investment at all, right? Back in the day, though, it was like, okay, we're forming a Wailing Caverns group. Who's in, and you might wait 45 minutes for a healer, right?
Yeah.
So the healer shows up and you're excited, and then they start playing a non-meta, right? And you're like, oh, we're going to kick you. You're playing non-meta. And everyone else is like, whoa, I'm not waiting another 45 minutes for another healer.
We're going to make it work.
Yeah, we're going to suggest kindly how they might want to mix in some of these other heals. But if they don't want to, that's totally cool, man. That's totally cool. Just don't leave us, right?
Please don't leave.
And so people are willing to work, and they're nicer, and they're, and that person, and they're going to get through the dungeon, right? It's not like Wailing Caverns is so difficult, right? That the guy just throwing one heal isn't going to get it done, right? So, but that's the thing. It's like nowadays, it's just everything is so about performance and speed, and and you can toss people out left and right, and you can get right back into it. That there's no investment, there's no social investment at all.
Yeah.
And here's the other thing about that healer is he probably wants to learn how to play the game better, but everyone's been such a dick to him in retail, right? They don't take the time, right, to help him understand what the better play is. So, it's a win-win all around. And before you know it, you might be grouping with that guy a few times, running around in WoW. You might end up in a guild, and now he's 3 times the player he was because you were patient and kind, and he took it on board, right? So, and you've graduated that guy from a casual guy to a core gamer, right? And if you look back at most of our histories, right, we started out as really bad players.
Yeah, we did.
But through some process, right, some of it social, we ended up as core or hardcore gamers, right? And so, give that next generation a chance, help them out, stop being a meta bully, right? And everybody wins, right?
That's fantastic. I really hope that that's, what we see with Pantheon. And I think from what we, the community is definitely on board with that sort of an approach to things.
Yeah. And that's that comes down to game design, and EQ is obviously there's toxicity in every game, but EQ is a very collaborative style game, and Classic was also collaborative. But you needed each other even less because you could solo in WoW all the way to 60, right? Yeah. Whereas a lot of, in EverQuest, a lot of classes had a really hard time soloing to 60. So collaboration and being kind of socially, reasonable.
Socially reasonable. I like that.
Was a plus, it was a huge element to getting along in the world. So any template that's sort of based on that kind of the need for that kind of cooperation is going to typically push those qualities to the top, and you're going to get better results within the community.
I sure hope so. I want to ask you about item design as the second part of this topic. One of your videos, you talked about how in vanilla WoW, some items were incredibly powerful and had like really wild procs and other effects. And they were in the same level range as other items that were basically like, trash by comparison. Right. You said, a lot of players view that as the heyday of itemization. But from a design perspective, the devs were taking a lot of risks, is what you said. Yes. So I was hoping you could maybe expand on that a little more. Like, what are the risks of doing that? And why do you think players enjoyed this so much? Is it just, nostalgia, looking back with rose-colored glasses, or is there more to it than that?
Definitely more to it. So there's two parts to it. One is the sort of endpoint of balance, which is a really tough thing to actually define, especially in a game like Classic, where people are still coming up with weird combinations of things. But there's kind of that side to it, is where do all these things land? And there's also so the risks are, one, you're going to create an item that's way out of bounds of everything else. And it's going to be long lasting. It's going to be so out of bounds that it's like best in slot at level 6, right? And also, or it trivializes some encounters that are meant to be really, really difficult, right? So, the case of the Paladin one-shotting Kha'Zix, basically, like if an item were to be able to do that, then that's clearly out of bounds, and you have to fix that as soon as possible, right?
Right.
So those are the risks you take, is that you actually break the game beyond reasonable limits. But also, just in terms of feedback, once people sort of figure out that some items are better than others, they rank them in terms of, like you were saying, power items are best in slot all the way down to trash. But there's a process, right, that's really good for the game, especially newer games, where players have to feel all that stuff out. And people love that process, right? They love engaging in that process. They love experimenting and trying new builds. And like, again, this goes down to like the Hearthstone analogy of a build around card, right? It's like those cards are really compelling, because they change the entire context of your collection and everything else you have and all the decisions you make based on one card, right?
That was my weakness in that game, was that I did a lot of my decks were just built around that one big legendary card that I loved so much that I wanted it in every deck, and I loved it and I wanted to make it work, and some were good and some you couldn't make work necessarily. So
that's the process, right? And you have to allow for that process to breathe. And that's why the risk that were taken and the wild variables on the items were so powerful, because it wasn't a spreadsheet determined thing. I can already tell you every item you get from here on out is going to be better than the last one, because you're going to be higher level, you're going to kill higher level things, and the things that drop are going to have slightly higher attributes, right? That's not a process. That's just you equipping the thing as soon as you find it. Whereas, in a more free form environment with lots of, risky procs and things like that, there's a whole process, because the character has to change as they get these new items. They have to experiment in different ways. They have to think about potentially other classes in some cases, or other builds or other talents or whatever it is. This would be great for me, but would this be great for my friend, that I can give this to? And people love that process. Some people don't like it. They just want to know what's the best and they want to put it on. And that's fine. But a lot of people love that process, and they love being the ones that participate in that process, math everything out, and create YouTube videos showing off their expertise, right? And you want to support that kind of thing within the game, because that's another way for people to distinguish themselves and differentiate themselves within the community and feel special and be beloved sort of by the community. So that's really important in game design, is giving players an opportunity to be creative and use their noodles in different ways to discover this stuff. And then, you can spend your whole career being that guy. You might not be the best at your rotations, but man, you can tell every person in your guild what items are better for them based on what they're currently doing. And they'll love you for it, right? Because their parses are going up.
That's right.
And they're like, they had no idea how to get there until you came along, right? So those are some of the fundamentals that I think are missing in a lot of MMOs these days, because designers are afraid to make bad items, right?
That's funny. That's so true, though.
But that's the risk. You make a bad item and then everyone thinks you're a trash designer, because why would you ever make this? Right?
So you're just constantly playing this game of one-upsmanship with yourself.
And so you have to be kind of, at peace with the fact that you're playing a totally different game, essentially, as an item designer. You're trying to create an experience that has a ton of texture, and there's positive and negatives. There's, good things and bad things. And again, the context is also really important, because some items are really good in raids, and some items are really good in PvP, and some items are really good in solo content and group content. And we don't know what kind of player you are, and we're not going to judge, right? So you can go do whatever, but we hope out there that somebody's enjoying a ton of the different items and not just vendor trashing, everything except for, 5 items or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And, that was a real common philosophy. And to go back to Magic from Richard Garfield was, there has to be bad items in order for people to appreciate the good items, right?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, absolutely.
And obviously you can take that a number of ways, and it sounds like nonsense to a power gamer, but
no.
There's a relationship there. And it's a relationship between the developers and the players. So I'm going to create an environment for you to participate in, and you're going to come back and tell me what the best stuff is and why. And I don't care that you tell me this stuff is terrible. I just created the toys for you to play with. It's up to you to figure out how you're going to play with them, and hopefully have a good time in the meantime.
Exactly.
It's funny. I'm a huge Magic fan. So as soon as you talk about those trash cards, I immediately think of the giant cockroach, the black giant cockroach. It's horrible. It's a horrible card. There's really no reason.
It's my old classic.
I remember one of my buddies, we were doing a draft, and he got that as the last card. And he's nice. He literally chewed it up and spit it out.
That's amazing.
I'll never forget that moment. But you're right. You're right. And we won't get into it a ton because it's a huge topic. I really enjoyed your itemization video. I really urge people to go watch that. I've actually linked it into various Pantheon communities because, and again, I'm not going to get a ton into it. Go watch the video. You covered it great. I love how you did the graph and showed that when you tried to have every stat meaningful, nothing's meaningful.
Right.
Oh my, because I remember the days of going for hit cap, right? And once you were there, okay, now or defense cap, you had to hit cap as a tank just to land your taunts, right? So I love that. So check that out if you guys want to get more in depth on itemization. That video is awesome. So
my favorite feedback from that video was that somebody noticed that I mislabeled my axes. I put plus X on the wrong one and the plus DPS on the other.
Oh, geez.
Of course they did, right?
And the whole thing is really sloppy graphics. That's part of the charm. But
no, it's just so true though. If you don't, decision making is important. It adds a lot of depth. It adds adds discovery, like you said, right? And if you take decision making out, what are we doing?
Right. Yeah, that's a big part of the game for a lot of people. So
I mean, it is even in D&D, right? You get a sword, you might not even know what it is, but it sounds cool, and then all of a sudden it has a special effect when you hit a vampire or something, right? It's just crazy, right? There's that discovery, and it creates this little bit of lore for the items, and they mean something. I mean, when every item is just yeah.
Then the DM, who's a big jerk, won't put any vampire dungeons in the game.
Completely meaningless item.
Yeah. You're like, is it a vampire? No, it's not a vampire.
No.
Damn it.
The last question I have for you for meta and itemization, and there's so much we could get into in this, but something I really enjoy, and I'm just curious on your philosophy as a class designer. There's a lot of people who like to just learn their class and that's it. And that's how it is forever. And that's what I'm going to do. And I'm good at it. I get bored of that. I usually towards the end of my WoW playing, I left after Old Year and BFA. And I played it from launch till then with a couple breaks. And one of the things for me was I'd play 4 or 5 characters fully raid geared. I was a guild leader. So I always wanted to be able to swap in. But what was awesome to me is my favorite class is when we'd get to a new raid tier, and you get those set bonuses, and it's almost that Diablo effect. It completely changes how you play. I love that. I don't want to play a rogue the same way for 20 years. I want to evolve it. Did you said that item designers versus class designers, they're kind of their own thing. How did you feel about sort of these set bonuses. Do you like that in the genre? Do you like the reinvention of a class mid-expansion like that, or changing how people play?
I've always, I mean, I grew up playing Magic, so the build around idea, is super, super compelling to me too. And I love that. I'm also a huge Altaholic, right? So like you, I can't do the same types of things too many times in a row before whether it's new content or playing a different class, I have to switch it up a lot. But definitely intentional. It's definitely intentional that we would have things that would come along and make you think about, okay, now what do I do with this? And it just sends you back to the lab, basically drawing up blueprints and figuring out how you're going to maximize the potential of this weird modifier, so absolutely. And to keep things fresh. And that was pretty common. It was sometimes it tried to be as gentle as possible in terms of encouraging you to try new things, but variety is the spice of life for any game that you're going to play, several years, not to mention decades. So getting people to sort of try different things, really important.
Mm-hmm. I just loved when you would, I'm trying to think as a class that like as a rogue, for example, a lot of people were playing combat, and then all of a sudden you could get, and this is in the Lich King days. I remember I was huge into Mutilate, but for Mutilate, you had to have like really specific items. If you didn't have them, like Mutilate was rough to play. But when you got them, it just unlocked like this whole new way to play rogue. And I like rogues a lot. And on top of that, I think it's blasphemy for a rogue to use anything but a dagger. I'm going to stay true to that. So I would not play combat. I was horrible. It's one of the only times I PvP'd in WoW, and I'm mad at whoever made this decision, and I hope it wasn't you, Kevin. but I was mad because the offhand dagger during the Lich King raid for Mutilate was a PvP, the best in slot, and I was like, no. And the grinding I had to do because I was so bad. I was so horrible. But when I got it, I remember I was at Saurfang because I played Alliance, where the rogue didn't have to do anything because you couldn't hit the two void creatures, or else they'd give health back. So the rogue got to sit still, never move, and DPS. And as a Mutilate rogue, it was the greatest thing that ever existed.
Nice.
But it's those couple items unlock something, or that one talent that people say, ooh, that talent's the worst. Then all of a sudden you get a set bonus that makes it 200% stronger or something, like, oh, wait, this is cool now, So. Yeah,
and sometimes we did that directly with the talents. Sometimes we did it with items or set bonuses, like you're saying. But it's hand in hand, right? Like your character choices, your item choices, and then the content you're facing is the other piece. And you want to keep that environment changing often enough that you're just always kind of thinking about what are good decisions here. If I really wanted to up my game to the next level, what could I do? Or am I happy where I'm at and I really enjoy this play style? So I'll just stick it out, try to maximize what I'm doing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting. That's just such player engagement, just always about maintaining that player engagement. Mm-hmm. And that sort of leads into the next topic that I want to ask you about. So we'll talk about player behavior and just sort of evolution of the genre as a whole.
And that's going to wrap it up with our first part of our interview with Kevin Jordan, WoW class designer from WoW Vanilla through Wrath of the Lich King. In the next episode of The Rewind next Sunday, we'll continue by talking about player behavior, genre evolution, and also open world instancing. And then we're going to take some questions from the mailbox like we typically would on a Rewind. Please join us next week, and we hope you've enjoyed this one. Please leave comments and make sure to check out Kevin's different social media platforms in the links below. Thank you, and we'll see you next week. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Pantheon Plus Rewind. Be sure to follow Minus and all Pantheon Plus related content on Twitter, Twitch, and YouTube under the name Pantheon Plus. Also, be sure to follow Theric at Pantheon Theric on Twitter. Keep up to date on all Pantheon Rise of the Fallen information on www.pantheon.plus, the definitive source for all media of Pantheon. Until next time.